Hello, all, and welcome to the topic of the desire to be proud of what we do. In other words, desire to become a craftsman. I know this term software craftsmanship is around or a couple of decades now, and there has been lots talked by either Andy Hunt, Dave Thomas, or Peter McBean since he wrote the first book on the software craftsmanship. And there is a tremendous amount of work done by Uncle Bob in this area, and I'm not going to talk anything other than what this has been already talked about. But this is a small attempt to bring some awareness or some kind of attention in this area. Though we know that this particular term is around for a couple of decades now, but I strongly believe that it is not getting the attention that it should have. So here is a small attempt that to bring the small awareness in the community that we are part of, the community of software engineers or the professionals. So here is the quick agenda. We'll try and look at the core belief of software craftsmanship and why the craftsmanship exists in the first place. Later we try and understand how can we become one, and eventually if there are any questions you could comment it and ask us as part of this video. Okay, with that, let's get started. So what kind of image do you see when you think of a craftsman? If you talk about the Middle Ages craftsmen, what do you think of them? An image of something like this, a sculptor or a potter or a jeweler or welder or a cobbler or a carpenter or maybe a watchmaker, welder and stuff like that. I'm sure when you think of craftsmen, which we know from the Middle Ages, the image would be somewhat similar. The guys who are deeply involved into their work, passionately working towards building that craft, no matter how much time it takes, no matter what kind of efforts it's required and stuff like that. The guy who passionately works towards and brings something out of it, right? Okay, so on the other hands, if we would just work with the bare hands, we would call them as a worker or a laborer. And when it comes to a guy who works with his hands and something, we would probably call them as a craftsman. And then throughout this presentation or this discussion, we will try and understand what are those two additional things that a normal worker, besides normal worker, the craftsmen are doing. Okay, so let me ask you one simple question. So when it comes to these guys that we have talked about from the Middle Ages, these craftsmen that we have seen, when it comes to a software engineer, what do you think? Do we call ourselves also as a software engineer? Maybe yes, maybe no. If you ask me, yes, I strongly believe that yes, I am also a craftsman and would aspire to be one. And why do I do that? I also work with just bare hands and with my keyboard as a tool, probably mouse and bunch of other soft tools, and create something out of it, isn't it? And on the process of building that software, should I really care about what I build or what is the end result of it? Of course, anything that we do, we should be careful about building, but in this term, building a software, do I really care? Would it have any impact on anything? Now let's try and answer that in a different way. Would there be anything at stake when it comes to software development or the piece of code that we write, and when it comes to the usage of it, would something be at stake? Maybe fortunes would be at stake? Or what about lives? Do you think that lives at stake? Now if I go back a step back and try and understand how many computers were there during 1946? Just one. Yeah, we had only one computer at that point in time. And how many computers are there today? As I speak at this moment, I have a webcam that is recording, which has a processor. I have a screen that is recording this. It has its own processor. I have a keyboard which is wireless. I have a mouse that is also wireless. I have my iPad that is helping me with some of the notes that are there for this presentation. I have another computer which is as a standby. I have a watch which also has another microprocessor. It's a Garmin, and so on and so forth. There is a light behind me which is controlled by a sensor, and this microphone that I'm speaking with, besides many other microprocessors that are running around. Right, I have my mobile here which probably has more than one microprocessor in it, right? And the people that are watching this discussion at this moment, you look around and you would see there are probably a few dozen microprocessors. If you look around, that you would see. Now in 2018, or I think it's 19, they just roughly counted possible number of computers. There were billions of them, right? And as I speak today, if I talk in terms of the soft processors, basically there'll be even hundreds and hundreds of thousands of computers and microprocessors that are surrounded by us. And you name an activity that we are not dependent on computer. Almost every single activity that we do in a day-to-day life, whether we watch news, watch television, the transportation, or the you name anything in the life, every other thing is being controlled by some or the other processor, and all these processors are executing some of the other instructions written by people like you and I. So if every single thing that happens around us is controlled by some of the other lines of code that are written by people like us, and think of something going wrong in them, what can happen? I am damn sure that the fortunes can be created or destroyed. Similarly, lives can be saved or can be destroyed. So yes, we are talking about, we must care for what we write, what we do, and there are a lot of lives and fortunes at stake while we work on these areas. Having said that, let's try and understand from history. Is it just I'm talking out of a theory, or is it something really that has happened in the past? Of course, there may be some of the other issues that would have happened in the past, but is it really that big to talk about it? Let's see. I'm sure some of you would have heard, and many of you would not have heard of something called as World War III. Quite interesting, yeah. And to be honest, it did not happen, but it could have happened. And if it would have happened, it would have been a mistake of software, the instructions that you and I, people like us, would have written that, right? So what has happened in 1983, in September 26, 1983, Soviet had built an early warning system called OKO, which was basically to find out if there is any incoming missile towards them. And on this day, basically, the software reported that there is a missile that is incoming from US, and the person who was using that or monitoring the system went restless. Immediately he saw that another 4 missiles were coming. The software reported that another 4 missiles are incoming. Had he thought that this particular thing was correct and would have reported that to his superiors, and his superiors would have believed what software had reported, we definitely would have had World War III. And I'm sure you and I would not have been talking, or would not have been in this situation at this moment. I'm not sure I would have been in a living person or not. I'm really not sure about it. Yeah. And what was the problem? It was basically a failure to find the false alarm or eliminate the false alarm. What had happened? It was a glare from the sun that it mistook as the incoming missile. There we have a software doing something wrong. Terrac 25, another classic example, and this is one of the example that is being taught in many universities as one of the case study that what a software bug can do and what we should or should not be doing, right? What has happened in this case? In this case, this particular device was, or the instrument was designed for cancer treatment, and it had various versions of it. So basically they had a Terrac 10, and there was some working piece of code which they picked up and reused that code into Terrac 25, and there were some race conditions. It was supposed to do, not supposed to do certain things, when you provide some range of radiations, what it should do, what it should not do, things like that. And guess what, things went wrong, and it literally shot the radiations of 100 times more than what was supposed to be doing. Why? Because the coders assumed that the things that was working in Therac 10 would perfectly working fine with Therac 25. So there was no enough testing done, or there were certain assumptions that went. The result, 6 lives lost and many got injured. You can think of what would have happened to the company and people around us. So it was also called as a cancer zapper. What was the issue? A simple copy paste. The another interesting theory, in 1990, AT&T network went down for about 9 hours, and what was the result? About 75 million calls went unanswered. Why? There was a simple break statement which was nested in a switch case and an if statement. Now, who would have thought that one small break statement can bring down the whole network for few hours and millions of calls going lost? I'm talking about 1990. Now think of if this would have happened today, what would be the impact, and what that company is lost and stuff like that. Many other things can go wrong. Who was the culprit? A simple single statement. The next one, NASA's Mars orbiter. So this was another classic example where two different teams from two different geographical locations were working together to solve, or to do this mission successful. So they are working on a different pieces of components in that particular whole solutioning part. And both of them, with their natural tendency, they used the units that they have been using in their geographical location, and nobody thought about it. As a result of that, when it was in the orbit of Mars, atmosphere, it failed to do some of the conversions, and boop, it burned. It failed. We lost millions of dollars. Assumptions. Unit conversion. Heartbleed plug, another interesting thing, yet one of the biggest thing. Probably it was in 2012, and it took pretty good time for people around the globe to fix this issue, or this was one of the most vulnerability that we have had seen it. Basically, it was part of OpenSSL, where if your machine is infected with this issue, anybody around the world could read the data from your memory. Why? One of the boundary condition was missed in test cases. So one of the bound check was missed, and then this bug was missed, and the hackers exploited that weakness. Bang on. Things went really, and it is one of the biggest vulnerability threat that we have seen in the history. PowerPeg, this was basically for the Knight Capital. It was a nightmare for them. This was one of the biggest, largest trader in the United States in 2012. So they had one system called PowerPeg, which was basically buying the large trades, breaking into smaller trades, and then selling it off. And this particular algorithm was kind of stopped. They were not using it. However, this software was installed in all the servers. After a few years, they decided to come up with a new system, better, and so on and so forth. And yeah, the system was ready. The day of go live came, and they went one fine day. They went go live. It was all fine until somebody forgot to upgrade the system on one of the server. So what's wrong? Anyway, it's a stock software. There's nothing wrong with it. But there was one global variable which was a flag which would activate the PowerPeg algorithm to do the job what it was supposed to do. However, the new system was also using this global flag for something else. You understand what would have happened. After some time, the new software used that flag, set it on, and one machine where this was not supposed to be, it was not upgraded, and the flag was used for something else. In no time, this algorithm bought $7 billion worth stocks in the and then it was unintentional. It was not supposed to happen. The next day they were obliged to buy those payout and stuff like that. They had to pay more than 400 and plus millions of dollars, which was not even the value at that point in time. They literally went bankrupt. So one global variable or one dead code, and you have the example. Ariane Flight 541, that's basically it's a maiden flight, and just 36 seconds after its maiden flight, it literally burnt into the atmosphere. Why? Simple data overflow error. So somebody thought it's a 16-bit variable, but then they tried to fit in 64-bit value in it, and system went into multiple failures, and it was finally triggering the self-destruction. Millions of dollars. Simple data overflow. Day of living dead. Another example. In this case, though fortunately nobody died. However, software reported that over 8,000 people are dead, and it sent the information to the insurance agency. It sent the information to the family saying that so and so person has died. It created a havoc. It also financially penalized the software, and so on and so forth. What was the issue? Very simple mapping error. So there was a different code for death, and somebody's alive. In some combination, it got messed up, and you have a very big issue happened in the lives of these 8,500 patients. And the first example, we saw that the software was falsely showcased the incoming missile, and in this case, Patriot fails soldiers. This particular case, where what has happened is there was in 1991 there was an incoming missile during the Gulf War, and system failed to detect that this incoming missile is actually going to hit them. And why? Because of a simple rounding error. So when it was doing a lot of calculations, it was finding the actual position of the incoming missile after these calculations. After 5 or 6 decimals, it started rounding off, because it did not consider that at that large value of precision might create a different position of that missile where it would come and hit, and people died. Rounding error. Very small issue. This is very funny and interesting thing. Of course, I wouldn't say it's funny, but it is an interesting case. This happened with one of my friends' company. I cannot name it for various reasons. However, it was a very interesting case where a developer was testing these insurance purchases. During the final testing, he decided to put just 1 rupee, so he could test the whole logic once. And guess what? He forgot to remove that the hard-coded value. And what could be the result? People started buying this insurance for just 1 rupee. So, and it was a nightmare for the company when they realized that some of the customers have already purchased the insurance for just 1 rupee, and they had to literally call the respective customers and convince them to pay the remaining money. Some paid, some didn't. Hard-coded value. So we have seen that a dead code or a copy paste, an assumption, simple overflow, simple break statement, some rounding errors and things, so on and so forth, can create issues where the companies have lost their fortunes, people have lost their lives. So we must care for what we do. That's all I wanted to say. Okay, with that, it comes to a next very interesting topic of software. If you look at the word, it's a compound word. So what is made of? It's made of soft and ware. And why? What do you mean by soft? So if you look at one of the dictionary meaning of soft is something that is easy to change, easy to replace. It's not that hard, changeable, Now, if you step back and look at, we had hardware around us for some time before the softwares were. We had machines which we were using it, and anytime when there was a need for that machine to behave differently, we literally had to go and change some of the components of that machine so that it starts behaving differently. However, software gave us that ability. The same machine can start behaving a little different, or in a completely different way, differently, if we change that code. So the very existence of software itself is for its ability to change, isn't it? Now, with that, let me show you, is it enough for some software just to work, or we need something else? Uncle, this is most of this information that I am sharing here is from the sessions and the videos of Uncle Bob. I must admit that there's nothing that I have done from my side. So it is just not enough for code to work. What else do we want? We want the ability, how easily we can change that. As we have already seen, that the very existence of software itself is for the purpose of not just to work, but how easily we can make changes and suffice the needs of the customers, that it has to slowly start change its behavior when needed, and so on and so forth. What else do we need besides the ability to change, or how easily we can change the software? It works, it should change. What else do we need? We also want the people to be proud the way we work, right? We all would love to see people, to see ourselves and be proud of what we do. Otherwise, there's no point. Otherwise, we're just doing for sake of it. What else do we want? Who else do we want? We also want people around us to be proud of. It's just not us. We also want people to be proud about the way we work. Who are these people that we're talking about? Our colleagues, our manager, our employer, our partner, and our all the community people that we are part of or that we live with, right? The community of software professionals, programmers, and so on and so forth. And we also want people to be struck by the discipline, the way we work, by the orderliness that we organize ourselves, by the care that we showcase towards our product, towards our piece of code, towards our delivery, towards the document, and so on and so forth. And of course, towards the craftsmanship, the craftsmanship that we showcase. So we want, when people look at us, we want them to be struck by all of this. How wonderful would that be, isn't it? And what happens when we do all of this? What happens when we strive for such a strong discipline, such a strong, the principle or things that we want to do for ourselves? What happens when we do that? Of course, it engenders the trust. If let's say my boss is proud of the way I work, he gets struck by my care, my orderliness, my craftsmanship principles, and so on and so forth. Of course, it definitely builds the trust between us. And what happens when we build that kind of trust between me, my manager, my colleagues, and my employer, and my partner, and my customer, and so on and so forth? What happens? Basically, it divides the heel between the development and the business. Now, if you look at one of the important reason that Ken Beck promoted the extreme programming was to basically heal this divide. And we all, as a software professionals, would also like to work in a co-creation mode, where we want to be a trusted partner of a business, and we want business to be a trusted partner of us, so that we should be sharing the common vision that we are building towards. We are sharing the common vision, so that whatever we build is the same, and together we are finding that solution, finding the facing the challenges, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens when we don't have this dividing between both of us? There is no blame game. We fail together. We succeed together. If for any reason there are in some situation we are not able to meet our target, we are dealing, or something is not coming as expected. At the same time, if our partners are aware of the passion that we are working with, the care that we are working with, the kind of craftsmanship that we are showcasing, they understand us. Yes, I know, yeah, this XYZ guy, I know Bharat, he's been doing this. I know his honesty, his principles, the way he works. So there is definitely a challenge that because of which he is not able to deliver this, and they definitely support us in such situations. So it not only shares the common vision, it also shares when there are challenges, when there are failures and stuff like that, and there is no blame game. In fact, in such situation, we again come back together and strive to find the next best solution in that given situation. There you go. Yeah, it is said and done. It is very easy to say, but how do we get there? It's just not easy. I mean, I am working in Bangalore, somewhere in some corner of the office, and due to COVID, of course, in my own home, and my customer partners are somewhere in across the world, in Europe and US and some part of the other area. So we are trying to build the trust where we are not even seeing each other day-to-day basis. So how do we get there? It's not that easy to build trust just like that. If this would have been easy, it would have been really nice, but it isn't. So what do we do? So it is possible only with the bunch of promises and the disciplines that we can showcase. So what kind of promises that we are talking about, and where do they come from? Yeah. So, I mean, in other words, if you talk about the profession of doctors, lawyers, and policemen, and army guys, and so on and so forth, all these guys, if I'm not wrong, you would have seen that when they start their career, they take an oath. They promise themselves with bunch of principles, bunch of ethics, that no matter what happens, they'll follow, or they will carry out their duties by following these values and principles. And I think we as the community of software programmers or the professionals, we should also have such strong promises or principles or oaths. Uncle Bob says oaths, also says promises and stuff like that, or the principles that we want to make. And whom do you want to make these promises? We want to make to myself. I want to make to myself so that no matter what happens, I will do this. I will always do this. Yeah. And who else do we want to make these promises to? We want to make these promises to the community that we are a part of, right? Of course, only and there is a very nice philosophy if you look at the psychology, and whenever you commit, generally, if it comes to resolutions during the new year, you secretly say, this from the next year I'm going to do this, I'm going to hit the gym, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. But if you make only to yourself, there are high chances that after the first 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, slowly you will miss 1 day, 2 days, and then over a period of time you will forget it. However, if you make them public, if you make them publicly to your friends, your families, and your office colleagues and all, hey guys, look, from next year onwards, this is what I'm going to do, 1 2 3 blah blah blah, ta ta ta. Guess what? It creates the positive pressure. It builds this positive pressure or a reinforcement from your friends and colleagues. You're kind of obliged to follow those promises that you made to public. So there are high chances that the promises that you made openly to your community that you're part of, that such promises you always try to follow. It's very difficult to say it publicly and then say, no, I'm not doing it. So not just make those promises to yourself, make those promises to also to the community that we are part of, to your manager, to your employer, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Okay. And where do these promises come from? Of course, so we have our man Ken Beck. So you have seen, decades ago there was agile movement, and then we had extreme programming, and then we have a software craftsmanship. Now you may ask, oh, there are these things, and there are so many other things as well. Now, if you look at, they are no different. The agile movement is there, and then if you look at the extreme programming is the direct descendant of agile movement, and the software craftsmanship is also direct descendant of both of them. So naturally these promises come from all these areas only. So if you look at these principles that I have on the screen with these two circles, they all come from the practices of extreme programming, and all the promises that we will talk in a moment would come from one or the other areas, whether it is a pair programming, whether it is a test driven development, whether it is refactoring, whether it is incremental releases, whether it's a feedback loop, whether it's a collective ownership, where we support for each other, the planning, and win together, fail together, the whole team concept, and so on and so forth. So all of this, or the continuous integration that we'll talk in a moment. So these promises that we are going to talk about, they will come from, or they are from these areas only. So there is nothing new that I'm talking here. This all is there. Most of us are following the agile methodologies, the agile way of development. Some of them may be following partially. However, they all come from this. Okay. Having said that, let me present to you one of the definition of the craftsmanship. So you would have seen so far what we've talked about: the passion, we've talked about the discipline, we have talked about the people who are really motivated to do this. So if you look at the Middle Ages craftsmen, there was nobody telling them to do this or do that, like this, like that, nothing of that sort. They were highly motivated to craft whatever they were doing, whether it's a sculpture, or whether it is the woodwork, or a welder, or a jeweler, or a blacksmith, you name it. So we are talking about, the software craftsmanship is all about the building the culture for passionate, disciplined, and motivated people who aims to write well-crafted software and continuously deliver value. Now, all of this we are talking about, we shouldn't be doing it for sake of it or for the goodness of it. There is no end for perfection if you really talk about it. So we don't want to go to the point where we are working on perfections, but then it is not delivering the value. There's no point in it. So we definitely want to do this to the extent where it also has to deliver value to our customers, our partners. Otherwise, there's no point in achieving a perfection and doesn't do anything about it. No? There's another beautiful definition that I talk about is all putting the responsibility, the professionalism, the pragmatism, and that's why I love another book by Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas. It's the Pragmatic Programmer. You have lots and lots of tips, more than 50 if I'm not wrong, on the same area of what you should do and how you should do and what you shouldn't be doing, so that eventually we become the pragmatic programmer or the craftsman, and so on and so forth. So the software craftsmanship is all about putting the responsibility, professionalism, pragmatism, and pride back into the software development. Yeah. With this, I'd like to share a very simple story. I'm sure you all would have heard this, or some of you would have heard about it, but this is the right time that I would love to share this story, and it goes like this. Once upon a time, every story should have that. So once upon a time, there was a sculptor. He was working on a small sculpture or idol, and he is passionately engraved himself into that work that he's doing. He's almost forgotten what is happening around him. And in some time, there is one person passing by from there. He comes there, looks at his work. The guy is deeply into his work. He also looks at this idol that is already ready, and it's just there lying next to him. And the patiently, in a silent voice, he asks the sculptor, "Hey buddy, do you need two of them? And where are you going to install them?" The guy, he's already busy, buried into his own work. He doesn't even look at him. He says, "No, I just need one." The guy's surprised, shocked. "What are you talking about? You just need one? Why the hell are you making the other one? Of course, he doesn't say it so rudely, politely, yes. So, my dear friend, tell me, if you need one, why are you making the other one? You already have it ready. The guy continues his work. He doesn't even look at him, and he just simply says, the other one has a defect. The guy just looks at here and there, and he says, I don't see it anywhere. And then the guy doesn't even look at him. The guy is slowly getting pissed off. He then starts looking everywhere, details here, there, back, front, up, down, everywhere he checks. And finally, he asks, I don't see any problem with it. What are you talking about? And the guy tells him, look at behind the left ear, there is a small scratch. The guy, kind of puts off, goes back and patiently looks behind the ear, and yes, there is a small scratch which is of just this hair size, which is not at all visible. Actually speaking, you have to pay a little attention to it, only then it's visible. The guy further gets pissed off and says, come on buddy, are you joking? There is a small scratch which is of this size. It is behind the ear. What are you talking about? Who's going to know about it? Why are you working on this so hard, spending so much time on it? What's the point in doing all of that? This time guy puts down his tools. He looks at him patiently and he says, you know what? Who's going to know about it? I will know it. I will know that there is a defect. There is a problem in it. And that knowingly, I wouldn't want that particular thing to be used. And there is a surprising fact that I miss in the story. This particular sculpture, that idol, is supposed to be installed at almost 20 feet tall, and when he tells to the guy gets even pissed off. So the moral is all about the desire to be doing the right things even when nobody's watching you. In fact, the craftsmen cannot work, or you cannot be calling yourself as a craftsman when there are people auditing you, telling you, okay, fix this, fix that, and your intention is to fix only when they tell you. Otherwise, if it is working fine, let it go. No, that's not the true craftsman. True craftsmen will work even when nobody's watching them, even when there's no auditing, there's no tool, there's nobody going to find and fix it. If you know it, you will fix it, no matter what happens, no matter if people says yes or no. At the same time, you don't want to do it to an extent where it is not going to add a value, and so on and so forth. If you really want to know this concept even better, I would highly recommend you to look at the first concept that Andy and Thomas have talked about, is the living with a broken window, or not to live with a broken window. What happens with, even when there is the smallest mistake that it and it's okay, it's not going to harm so much, and so on and so forth, it's okay about it. No, it's not. So if you really want to know it, I would highly recommend you to go and read that part or understand that concept, and then you will see why this guy was so passionately working on it. And when he knew that there is a small scratch back of the ear, and he didn't want it to do that. So this is the thing that we would like to build, that as a culture. And in the beginning, we talked about the worker is basically the one who works with the bare hand. And here we are talking about the craftsman, who is not just working with his hand, he's also using his head, and he's also using his heart, right? He is emotionally connected to what he's building, and he's passionately working towards that, fixing all possible things that he could, not to bring in the perfection, but to deliver a best quality product, or I cannot say that defect-free product. I would rather say that it will do all that it is supposed to do without an error. Right? With that, I would like now to present the promises, and I would like to conclude so that we could talk a lot in our next session, where we'll talk about these promises in detail. And I would like to remind you guys that none of this is my work. It is all already done by all the guys like Pete McBreen, or the Ken Beck, or Andy Hunt, or Dave Thomas, or predominantly by Uncle Bob, Martin Fowler, and these guys. So all of this, I've just compiled it and brought it here. None of this is mine. With that, let's start these principles that Uncle Bob has called them as oath, or promises, or principles. The first one, I will not I will do no harm when I develop my code. And I'm sure there's no need to talk more about this, as we have seen the examples. We've talked about fortunes, we've talked about lives, and so on and so forth. That's about it. And we will talk a lot when we get into the details of this. The second one, my code will always be best of my work. I'll always create the best quality of my work. What it is basically talking about, if you know that there is a better code that you could write, or you know that this particular thing I could do it better, there is a refactoring I could do it, or there's a variable name, it's not that self-explanatory, it's too technical, I could make it much more which is business understandable, or it's too cryptic which I only understand and my team members cannot understand. If you know such things, then that's not your best work, and I will not do such things. I'll always try and do the best of my ability work. Third one, I'll always produce give the receipt of my work, or I can always say that my code works always in all situations. When I hand it over, what it's basically talking about, a simple receipt of 0 test cases failed, and this receipt to my manager, to my company, to my organization, to my partners, that it's a proof that my code works. Yeah. I'll always give incremental releases, or I will always produce something that is small and incremental, isn't it? I'll make frequent and small releases. And what it basically is talking about, it's just not delivering something as a minimum viable product to your partners. We are also talking about a small pull request that I've done, and then somebody quickly reviews it, merges with master. I don't want to live in an area where your pull requests are living for 5 days, 6 days, month, and then you want to merge, then there are conflicts and so on and so forth. No, nothing like that. That's a simple example of a pull request. It could be a simple document, a story that you have created, and you have asked someone to review. So you have asked them to review, and the feedback that you are receiving for that review is quick and short, incremental. So here what we're talking about is the feedback loop, and it is also one of the 4 core values of extreme programming, the feedback. We'll talk a lot in detail later. I will always strive to do better. I will continuously improve. I'm sure you would have heard the term called as Kanban, continuous improvement. And it is very much popular in many areas, not just here. So anything that you do, or you could talk about Boy Scout principle, where we talk about I will leave the camping ground better than the way I found it. So if you are reading a document or documentation of something, or you are reviewing the code, or you're modifying small piece of someone else's code, or enhancing something, at every possible step I will try to do it a little better than what it was earlier, and I will not miss out on opportunities. If there is one test case that I think that it can add a value, I will go and write it. If there is a small automation that is going to help me to reduce my repetitive work, and if I know that, I will do it. So on and so forth. Many such things. The next one talks about I will do all that to keep my and my team's productivity as high as possible. What we're talking about here is basically, because of me, there should not be any bottleneck or breaks for my team. I can give a simple example is, because of my check-in, code commit, CD pipeline is broken, and now nobody is able to do the next steps, like your test cases are not running, your build is not getting generated, your integration testings are not running, your performance tests are not running, and so on and so forth. Your deployment is not happening, your BDDs are not running, and many other things. And similarly, another example could be, I will not go and merge something, or after a month of working, I'll go and say, okay, now you go review all that file, it will perfectly go and work, and you merge the code, and things are gone. So in any way, I will not create a hindrance to my team in any possible way, or I will not write something that is only I understand. So when I'm not around, nobody can work. I wouldn't do that. Next one is basically I will support for my team, and so does team for me, and it is one of the main principle that I love, and we extremely extensively practice this thing in my teams, is basically pair programming. So one of the very important part of pair programming is, to build the competencies so that, people learn from each other. They know their styles, like one is the navigator, one is a driver, and then you switch the places every couple of hours, and you do that. But ultimately, if you look at what it is essentially doing, is that piece of code, while developing and learning from each other, what is happening in reality is both of them are completely aware of what is happening. Now we are two people who completely knows how does that code work. Now let's say for some reason I go on sick leave, I have something important stuff to be taken care, I'm not available. Of course, there is someone else who knows it. And likewise, if we keep working with the different people in our team, of course, we are not talking about a team of 30, 40 size, we are talking about 2 pizza size teams. Maybe 8-member team with 5 or 6 developers. So, we could work on each other's code together using pair programming techniques. With that, at the end of the day or after some time, almost everybody in the team is aware of what is happening throughout the code. Now, it not just solves the problem of dependency or, covering for each other, it also builds the knowledge within the team. So when tomorrow somebody is working on someone else's code, it is not someone else's code, it is their own code. The code ownership lies with everybody, and there are production incidents, there are enhancements and anything. I'm pretty sure that the productivity will never drop because I don't know how does that work. That kind of things will never come. Yeah. But then the next one, and the most difficult one or the interesting one is I will always create honest and accurate estimates. Now, if I ask you the question, who's good at giving the accurate estimates? Yes, you're right. The answer is nobody. Nobody can give proper estimates. And so if I ask you, give me what is the right estimate for this? And you would say, I don't know. Maybe that's the right answer. Of course, it is the right answer, because if you look at the definition of a project, it is a unique endeavor, right? Resulting, blah, 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 as per the PMI. If you see, if it is a repetitive, it would have been operation, not the project. So if you do repetitions, you know how you have done, how much time you have taken in the previously. So you could concretely tell, okay, if I have to manufacture this glass, how much time it would take, I can clearly tell you. But if I have to develop some glass which is never in existence for the first glass that I'm doing, which is a nature of project, you don't know. So you go with so many other things. So then in such situation, how can you give accurate estimates? Well, you can add something to that don't know, and that additional things could be, okay, fine, if things go well, maybe I could do it in 1 week. Fair enough. Okay, if things go the way typically go in our team, maybe I'll take 3 weeks. And if things go to hell, 10 weeks. Okay, fair enough. Not bad. So it is my managers or scrum masters or somebody's responsibility to ensure that things don't go to hell and things don't go typically the way they usually go, isn't it? So we try and, if we control the things going wrong, then probably what the estimate was given in the first place might work perfectly fine. Maybe with little here and there. Of course, you got to go with iterations, work on those things, but never give inaccurate estimates, because if you compromise at estimates, I can guarantee you that other things will start taking the toll on it, whether it's a quality, additional time that you want to do on writing extensive test cases, spend more time with your team members to do pair programming, improve the productivity, use the Kaizen principles to, find those smaller opportunities and make things better. All those things will become very challenging when you are in, when you put in crux of time. So I highly recommend to pay real good attention at this particular principle. Last but not the least, learn. I'll continuously learn. Not just this industry, and of course this particular industry needs it more. Of course, it is applicable to every industry, that if we stop learning, we stop living. Actually, we live just monotonous life. It's just, we know what we are and we just do what we do. We've been doing. That's not the idea of it. So if I continuously learn, my next act will always be better than what I was doing today or yesterday, and so on and so forth. And the best way to learn is teach it. isn't it? And that is the attempt of this discussion of software craftsmanship, because I am in the process of learning craftsmanship. And when I openly, publicly say certain things about it, I had to be 100% sure about what I'm speaking. So, because of which I would end up learning many things about it. So, best way to learn something is to teach it. So, with that, these are the 9 principles, and of course, you may add eventually, but then I found it very good set of covering most of the areas, and they all come from, if you try and look at every other things, you will find some of the other way they fit in what Ken Peck has talked about extreme programming, and this is what Uncle Bob has talked in his many discussions when he talk about craftsmanship. So if we follow these things along with the hand, the head and heart, I'm pretty sure that we can develop something that we all can be proud of, right? So with that, I'd like to just show you some of the books that I have been referring. Of course, all of them I have not yet finished, but I've been referring. The first one is Clean Code by Uncle Bob or Robert C. Martin, and one of the biggest contributions that has been made by him in this particular area. And I talked about the Pete McBreen, the first guy who wrote the book on software craftsmanship. Another book by Robert C. Martin on Clean Coder. It's basically talks about an individual and his promises, his practices, with a lot of examples that you would see. And if you really want to see tons of examples on code smells and refactoring techniques, the best book available in the shelves is Martin Fowler's. And another one that I already talked about, those 50 plus tips or techniques that has been talked with lots and lots of examples and anecdotes and stories. The Pragmatic Programmer by David Thomas and Andrew Hunt. So yeah, there you go. The another one is basically again Robert Martin series, but a different one on the software craftsman. And there are a few more about the code complete and working effectively with legacy code, as we know that every day we don't write the new code. We always, and 90% of the time, we work on a code that is already existing. We add features, we enhance, we do technology refreshment and so on and so forth, but it's a very unlikely that we always work on greenfield projects. It's a very less, or even if you work on partially, but it has to work with somebody. So we definitely have to be careful about those things. And the last one, of course, by these Gang of Four design patterns. It gives a lot of perspective of doing things right. Besides, there are so many things that we'll talk about, the solid principles, or the don't repeat yourself, or keep it simple, or the broken window, or there are so many other things. We will talk about it. So having said that, I hope that I was able to give some part of it in terms of awareness of why we need craftsmen in this industry, and how can we make differences in the way we do it, at the same time be proud of what we do, irrespective of people are watching it or not. Thank you very much.